The opinions expressed on this program represent the viewpoints of individual authors or contributors and do not necessarily reflect those of Troy University.
Welcome to International Insights. I am Doug Davis, and with me is Michael Slobodchikoff. On this episode, we'll be speaking with Mark Ward. He is a committed humanitarian who leads teams to provide critical help when natural or man-made disaster strikes. He saved lives and restored hope to communities affected by many disasters over 2 decades, including the 2004 tsunami, the earthquake in Pakistan, the civil war in Syria. He left Afghanistan in June of 2021, where he led a humanitarian organization for 2 years. President George Herbert Walker Bush nicknamed him Mr. Disaster after the tsunami work in 2005. Mr. Ward, welcome to the show from Oregon.
Thank you, gentlemen. Nice to be with you.
Mark, you were a key government official in managing relief in the 2004 tsunami and other projects in Afghanistan and Pakistan, to name a few. Through this, you worked with some key members in the U.S. government, including Paul Wolfowitz, Bill Clinton, and George Herbert Walker Bush. In fact, President Bush gave you the nickname Mr. Disaster, as Doug mentioned in the intro. What was your work, and how did you end up with this nickname?
Good question. It was a surprise to me, too, when I first heard it. So I had lots of jobs overseas and in Washington, D.C. After 9/11 and the invasions in Afghanistan and Iraq, the Foreign Service became a much more dangerous kind of work. And I found myself accepting positions in dangerous places. And for reasons I don't quite understand, I guess I worked pretty effectively in those situations. I ran USAID in Pakistan, for example. I worked for the UN in Afghanistan, then Libya during the Civil War, then on the Syrian border for almost 5 years. And President Bush, I always refer to him as 41, he knew me from the tsunami work that we had done together back in 2005. And I visited him once or twice a year, update him on my latest assignment, almost until his death. He was very interested, not only as a former president, but remember, he had also been head of the CIA and U.S. ambassador to China and to the UN. And I guess he liked my stories kind of from the front lines of hotspots around the world. Anyway, a few years before he died, I was visiting him at his home near Kennebunkport, Maine. And he saw me get out of the car and walking towards his house. And I remember he called out and he said, "Look out, here he comes, Mr. Disaster." And it stuck. I think there were a few witnesses. And I'd like to think it was a compliment, but I never asked.
Excellent. Mark, I have a follow-up question for you. When the U.S. provides relief for people who suffer from a natural disaster, what are the steps that have to be taken for the aid to actually reach the people who really, unfortunately, suffered the event?
It's a great question. Despite what you see on the news after, let's say, an earthquake overseas, the most important thing is not sending search and rescue teams ASAP. That's really expensive. It rarely gets there in time to actually help. But the White House loves it because it looks good on CNN. The most effective thing you can do is to provide funding immediately to the humanitarian organizations that are already there working in the country to provide help. They're already there. They know where to source supplies locally. And most important, they can quickly determine what's needed and who's doing what, so we don't waste time and resources. The less we have to physically bring in, the better, because airports are often either damaged or overwhelmed, and it's better to rely on local sources of supply to keep the local economy going.
Fantastic. So, Mark, you recently returned from Albania, where you worked to help settle refugees from Afghanistan. And you also helped settle them in the Emirates, in Abu Dhabi, as well as New Mexico. What is the status of Afghan refugees since the U.S. withdrawal, and how are they adapting in the West?
I don't know the numbers exactly, but there are still thousands of Afghans who helped the U.S. or NATO during our 20 years there who are waiting to leave Afghanistan. More than 100,000 have already resettled in the U.S., but more are still waiting. The State Department processes the visas and medical checks for these evacuees at a few locations around the world, including Albania. I was there for about 5 months last year, leading the State Department team, managing the Afghan relocation. I think the tens of thousands of Afghans who've already resettled here are adapting well. Most go to cities that already have Afghan communities where they have friends or relatives, and most had some experience with Americans before they left Afghanistan. That's why they're coming. So we're not completely foreign to them. Not surprisingly, the young people are adapting much better than their parents. Young Afghans pick up English very quickly if they don't already have it, and they do very well in school. It's harder for their parents and their grandparents, not surprisingly. Imagine what it would be like for us at our age to have to start all over again in a new country and learn a new language. Very, very difficult. And some of the parents and grandparents, I think, sort of give up when they first arrive and see how difficult it's going to be. But their kids really, I think, step up and sustain their families.
Excellent. Mark, when you were negotiating with the Russians over the humanitarian ceasefires in Syria, who exercised more control over the Russian side, Moscow's diplomats or the generals? How was the Russian government hierarchy present within the negotiations?
Yeah, very interesting. There's no question, the generals. Putin relied on his intelligence agencies and the military advice, not his diplomats. When we negotiated ceasefires for Syria with the Russians, military officers, very senior military officers from Moscow, really dominated their team. And I found that the most effective way to get Damascus, the Syrian government, to provide humanitarian access was to get the Russian military involved, if I could. The Assad regime in Damascus, they listened to the Russian generals because they desperately needed what the generals, their support. Less so with Russian diplomats. Their ambassador, the Russian ambassador in Damascus, he could be, and often he was, a great advocate for humanitarian access. But the Syrian government knew that he had really very little that they needed. And I think they largely ignored it.
So, Mark, you have had an impressive history in the State Department. Which Secretary of State, in your opinion, was the most effective, and why?
Yeah, I was in the Foreign Service for, well over 100 years, so there were a lot of I'm biased, and I think about your question from this perspective of a guy who focuses on conflicts and humanitarian aid, and John Kerry gets my vote. Secretary Kerry really cared about human suffering, and it showed in his determination to alleviate the suffering of the Syrians caught behind the front lines year after year. His energy, despite his age, was really boundless. And his experience as a negotiator from years in the Senate really kept us going and inspired us. And frankly, we learned from it. He never stopped trying. I remember he had us negotiating with the Russians on a ceasefire for Syria on his very last weekend as Secretary of State in January 2017. I mean, he was a total lame duck. The Trump inauguration was days away, but he wouldn't give up. Maybe the Russians were impressed. I certainly was.
That's actually quite a story. And I have a follow-up in asking you how the relief that the U.S. government provides in these situations where there's unfortunate disasters and crises, how does it change from administration to administration?
Yeah, interesting. So, Reagan was president when I joined the Foreign Service, Trump when I retired. And to be honest, most presidents didn't get involved in our response to a natural disaster overseas. It depended kind of how close it was to the U.S. and the potential for impact in domestic politics or foreign relations. For example, the response to the Pakistan earthquake in 2005 was a big priority for second President Bush, because Pakistan was a key ally in the war on terror. And President Bush W also introduced a new approach to natural disaster that really impressed me. And that was mobilizing the private sector to help. It started with the Indian Ocean earthquake and tsunami in late 2004, when he asked his father and President Clinton to work together to raise awareness of the needs in Indonesia, in Thailand, in the Maldives, in Sri Lanka, all the countries affected by the disaster. And this was unprecedented. No president before had reached outside of government for help. Then he asked well-known private sector CEOs to get their companies involved when earthquakes struck Pakistan in 2005, China in 2008, and after Israeli shelling in 2006. And the idea was that companies with business interest in those countries would survey the damage and provide the kind of support unique to their company to help the country recover or rebuild. For example, after the Pakistan earthquake, Pfizer, I remember, was involved, and they were able to provide amounts of antibiotics that were hugely important because of the infection that became such a problem because of so many acute injuries after an earthquake. I remember Cisco getting very involved in the China earthquake in 2008 by bringing some new technology on what I guess I would call like virtual medicine using technology to bring medical advice into remote parts of Chengdu or near Chengdu, where hit by the earthquake, where doctors physically couldn't get easily, but using Cisco technology to bring medical advice into the field for local practitioners, and many more stories. And I got very involved in these efforts and traveled with the CEOs a couple of times to ensure that their efforts were not at cross purposes with whatever USAID was doing after the disaster. And with very few exceptions, I really enjoyed the experience. So I've remembered, that sort of innovation of President Bush. And in later years, I've always encouraged USAID and even humanitarian organizations that I've worked with to consider partnering with the private sector because they do bring so much innovation that, with all respect to government, we're always a little bit behind.
Fantastic.
Don't tell anybody I said.
So, Mark, one of the things that we have is we have a lot of conversations with students and other people who are interested in pursuing careers in the Foreign Service. What recommendations would you have for students who wish to pursue such a career?
Yeah, thanks for asking. Yeah, I also spend talking to students. So I guess my quick and easy advice is, start reading about it. State Department's got a great website. Just click on career. USAID's got a great website. Click on careers. They both have thousands of officers in the Foreign Service. They also have thousands of officers in the civil service in Washington, but supporting what we do overseas. There are also governmental organizations, dozens of them working overseas, like the one that I ran in Afghanistan after I retired, where you get real experience early in your career. And there's two great websites to get more information about them. One is called DevX, DEV like Victor X, and the other is Relief Web. Those you can get a lot of information there. And students have to ask themselves, do you want to be a diplomat, or do you want to be more of a development or humanitarian expert like I was? Do you want to work a lot inside the embassy or with local government officials, or do you want to be out in the field, maybe getting your hands dirty a bit more? And a lot of students ask, well, what should I study and where should I study? And I love answering this question because I think I burst a lot of myths out there. There is no prescribed best path. I always tell students, study what you love and do well. That's the best path. Foreign affairs professionals that I've worked with over the decade have studied everything, even art history and dance. They ask me, should I study Arabic or Chinese? And I say, sure, if that interests you, but it's not a requirement. The most important thing, though, is to get experience. And I always say to students, look for opportunities to volunteer with charities and nonprofits in your own backyard in the U.S. This country has lots of issues with homeless, with refugees, in your part of the country with perennial disaster, natural disasters. It'll look great on your CV. It'll show us that you can work in difficult environments with very little resources and that you don't give up. And you'll learn a lot about yourself if you do this kind of work. if you're comfortable helping folks in need in the U.S., then chances are foreign affairs might be a very good career.
Mark, I have a follow-up question. And you have spent your life providing aid and helping people who have suffered through disasters. And often we hear there's a criticism, people who want to cut the U.S. budget in foreign aid. But you've seen how lives have been transformed and the good that actually foreign aid does. What arguments can you make, and what argument would you give to tell people that this is something that's very important to our nation's foreign policy and something we need to continue?
Yeah, it's a great question. Over my career, I've hosted a lot of congressional delegations at various I've been working on. I remember getting most of my visitors near the Syrian border. And I always took advantage of an opportunity to talk to members of Congress that maybe weren't great supporters of foreign aid, because I had an opportunity and I thought they needed to hear. And there's one story I always told, and that was after the Pakistan earthquake in 2005. And we did some polling after the earthquake to see what, if any, impact the huge U.S. response after the earthquake had on Pakistani perception of the United States. Because before the earthquake, we were not very popular. We had invaded Afghanistan, and we may or may not have been occasionally crossing the line and going after Taliban in Pakistan. And so we weren't very popular. And we were very curious to see whether our response to the disaster, the earthquake, which was one of the worst ever in a country that gets a lot of earthquakes, whether that had any impact on what people. And the result was remarkable. Perceptions about the United States climbed noticeably. But we weren't content to know the numbers of it. We sent teams out, obviously not teams of people like me, but Pakistanis, to ask why. What was it about the United States that they appreciated, they liked? And the answer was very clear across the communities that we spoke to in the earthquake-affected area. And it was very simple. You came, you stayed. You didn't come for a photo op. You set up, you helped us week after week after week. And that's true, we did. And we would see from our location, mountains in Pakistan, delegations from other countries who literally would fly in, and you could never miss it when they flew in because the dust from the helicopters was blinding. And they literally fly, give something, take a photo, and fly away. An hour later, they were gone. And I'm sure it was on the evening news in whatever country they'd flown in from. That was not our. We stuck with it for a long time. And the U.S. military actually left the MASH, I think most people know what I mean, thanks to the television. They left the surgical hospital behind as a gift to Pakistan after performing many surgeries because of all the broken bones after an earthquake. But the story I would share this story with visiting members of Congress because it showed the other important reason for humanitarian aid. And the humanitarian in me says it should be enough that our aid is humanitarian and meets what our obligations are under humanitarian principle. But it also helps America's national security interests. Here was a country extremely important to us, Pakistan, whose support we needed in the fight against Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. And this earthquake provided us an opportunity to show the Pakistani people that we cared about them.
Mark, I'd like to thank you for all of your efforts and your work in humanitarian aid. And I personally learned a tremendous amount today talking to you. I really appreciate you taking the time to speak to us. So thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
My pleasure, guys. All the best.
Thank
All the
you.
best.